Okay everybody, so in this video I'm going to be covering the crop tool. And the crop tool can be found in Develop just above your Basics tab here. Okay, so this is going to allow you to crop your image to different aspect ratios and kind of decide what you want to include and not include after you have made your picture. So if we engage the crop tool here, you'll see that we have this overlay of these grids, which reminds us of our rule of thirds. Okay, so it's kind of divided into three sections. And then we also have on the right hand side of your screen, we have the tool options. So here you have aspect and original, and then you can also change the angle in which you're cropping. But first, if you slide back over to the image, right away, if we were to just grab one of these edges, you can see that you can change where the crop fits. Okay. Right now, it's locked. So if we go back over to this right-hand side here, we see that there's this lock tool, meaning that the aspect ratio that it's currently at is locked, and we're at the original aspect ratio, which is a direct reference to the 35mm film aspect ratio, which is what your cameras are going to capture by default. Okay. So if we were to disengage the lock, okay, so now you can see it's unlocked, we can then have access to kind of freely cropping as we want to. I don't recommend that you crop really wildly or drastically for now. But you can see here that we have access to kind of a free crop if we unlock it, okay? Under the aspect area here, if we click on this area to the right of the aspect indicator, there's this drop-down menu, and it allows you to have access to different kinds of aspect ratios. So if I hit original, it'll take us right back to where we started. It'll also relock it. You can do custom, which is what we kind of did before. Again, you have to unlock it if you want to move it around freely. Go back to original. And then down here you have some preset crops. Okay, so these aspect ratios make reference again a lot to film photography. This 1:1 is a reference to 2 1/4 film or medium format film. It's also currently highly attributed to things like social media, right? The square image. But this is basically a 1:1. You have a square. And then this 4:5, 8:10, again, a reference to 4:5 or 8:10 film. I find that in my own work, I use this aspect ratio quite often. And it's probably because I come from this large format film background. I just like the way that it frames things within the image. So then we have this 8.5 by 11, and this is kind of the letter size that we're familiar with our paper, you know, our folder paper that we write on. 5:7. Again, this is going to be reference to 5:7 film. They made cameras that held film by 5:7. And then we have the 2:3, 4:6, which seems to be kind of our original aspect ratio. And then you have this 4:3, which is a little bit longer than 4:5 on the longest edge. Okay, so if we were to then go directly to 4:5, you can see that the 4:5 is a bit more narrow. Then you have this 16:9, which allows for a really kind of a skinny image. Okay. And then the 16:10, which allows for a little bit of a wider image, right? You can also enter custom crops. which I honestly never do, but if you want to, for some reason, control exactly what the crop is, you can do that. I'm going to hit cancel here. I'm going to go back to my original. And then here you have the angle. Okay, so if I were to shift the angle, it actually is rotating the image. All right, so this allows you to go from one extreme, rotating it 45 degrees, and then the opposite direction, 45 degrees. Okay. Back to the original. Okay, so we have a lot of options here. As I said a little bit earlier in the video, I wouldn't crop too heavily. The reason for that is when you do begin to seriously crop things, like I'll go ahead and just crop in quite dramatically here and zoom in here. Okay, when you do that, what's happening is you're enlarging the sizes of the pixels. Okay, so if I were to then hit done here when I'm thinking that I want this to be this way, if you zoom in, you can see that the pixels get quite large. Okay, and then if you were to take these to print, it wouldn't be the highest resolution possible. Right now with this image, I shot it at ISO 200, so the the pixels in the image are kind of fine anyway, so it's not as dramatic here. But if you were to shoot this at a higher ISO where the noise becomes greater, you would start to run into issues. Okay, so that's not to say that you can't crop. I'm just giving you forewarning that if you do crop very dramatically, then you're going to start to run into issues. So best practice would be to try to capture everything in your image in camera, and then come in and do minor crops when you're done with your image. So for example, if you know that you like the 4:5 ratio for your images, you can shoot in mind knowing that when you take the image into Lightroom, you're going to crop. So therefore, when you're out there in the field, you can kind of mentally account for different things at the edges, right? So you can say, okay, I don't really care if I have these wires up here, or I have so much of this crosswalk, because I'm then going to crop it so that I can control the amount of distracting elements that are in my image. Okay, so that's the crop tool in Lightroom Classic, and I'll see you next time when we go over the remaining tools.